honestly forget about holidays, and they tend to take us by surprise. It's really weird because everyone in the household works from home and for ourselves. So, you know, Christmas will be coming around and we'll be like, oh, wow, that's a thing. Yeah.
Oh, Zelda's moving in my house. Yeah.
Yeah. I was about to just like did I lose an entire month? Somehow I'm suddenly 31 because my birthday's right around American Thanksgiving. So I was like, what happened?
Yeah, no, I think it's Monday is the official Canadian Thanksgiving, but my family does it on Sunday. So that's Turkey Day for us this evening.
Nice. Somehow I did not know it was in October for Canada. I know when Canadian Independence Day is because we have a Canadian office.
You sure?
Oh, July, Canada Day, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, you're live.
Yes.
Hi, we're live.
That's perfect. So we are live.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Woo!
Yay, we did it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Cozy Romance panel where we talk about romance books in cozy fantasy. And feel free to plug anything you want. We are a very happy to support panel. If you want to talk about any of your projects, we're just happy to listen to everything. I'm going to pass you off to your host, Jess, and thank you all for coming.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to Mystic for having me and letting me host this panel. I'm really excited about it. My name is Jess Galaxie. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a queer non-binary author, indie author. I put out my debut novel just last year in November. It's called Feathers of Dawn, and the sequel and the conclusion to the duology Armor of Dusk is coming out December 6th. So you can pre-order that now if you would like. And I am very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to all of my panelists who are here. I'm super happy to have you all, and I would love for all of you to introduce yourselves and plug things like I just did. So whoever wants to go first, jump on it.
Oh, we can just go from left to right, I figure. Although I don't know if everyone's screens look the same, actually.
Yeah, that's why I said just somebody go.
Oh, okay. I'm Olivia Atwater. I wrote the Regency fairy tales, starting with Half Soul. I've recently started the Victorian fairy tales, starting with The Witch Would Not. And this month, actually, at the end of the month, a steampunk fantasy that I co-wrote with my husband called Echoes of the Imperium is coming out. And yeah, that's what I got other than my other cup of coffee. So
amazing. Love it.
I passed the ball.
Yeah. How about I can call people out. Kimberly, you want to go next? You're the next one on my screen.
I guess. So I'm Kimberly Lemming. I wrote the Mead Mishap series, like that time I got drunk and saved a demon. February 18th, I got abducted by aliens, and I'm trapped in a rom-com. My titles are so long, even I struggle. Anyway.
But I love your title.
Yeah.
Thank you. I write goofy fantasy rom-coms. Hello.
Oh, Heather, you're next on my list. So.
Lets me unmute myself. Yeah, so I'm Heather, and I started off writing kidlit, mostly fantasy in large part, but I do have a couple of contemporary middle grade books out now. And currently I'm working on the Emily Wilde series. The first book is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, and the third book is actually out this February, and that is Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to talk cozy fantasy with you. It's a category I just kind of stumbled into somehow. So yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Lisa, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Lisa LL Starling, and I write really chonky, bonkers, fantasy, cozy rom-coms that have sort of an 80s fantasy movie feel. So you have a whole lot of very roguish, charming characters, adorable, magical creatures, and sorcerers in really tight leather pants, because I watched Labyrinth in my phone. And it really
We've had this discussion, yes.
Right. Yep. You're speaking to the choir.
Right. So, yeah. So, and the sequel I'm in third draft of is going to be Otherworld. Again, another very, very chonky fantasy rom-com. So, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel, especially with some familiar faces that I've been on panels with before. So thank you for having me.
I'm the unfamiliar face, but I am super excited to be here. And I think a couple of you guys touched on this already. So my first question for you all, I wrote Feathers of Dawn, not intending for it to be cozy fantasy. I wrote it, and one of my friends beta read it, and she actually went, "Hey, you realize you have a cozy fantasy here, right? Like that's what this is. It feels like a cozy mystery, but like a fantasy." So I'm just curious, who here on the panel went into this intending to write cozy fantasy, and who here kind of stumbled upon cozy fantasy, which I think happens to quite a few of us. So anyone who wants to jump in on that, feel free.
I'm not sure the term cozy fantasy existed when I started writing it. It was very I kind of just wrote my first, I guess you'd call Half a Soul my first cozy fantasy. Technically, I had another pen name that was Paranormal Romance. We don't speak of that. But Half a Soul was kind of the first book that I wrote where I was like, I'm just going to do everything I want to do. I'm not writing to market. I'm not trying to write a bestseller here. And ironically, that was the one that did really well. And then at some point, people started talking about cozy fantasy and being like, this is a cozy fantasy, which shocked me because frankly, there's some very dark stuff in there, but okay. I didn't pick it. If you want to call it cozy fantasy, then it is cozy fantasy.
Yeah, I would echo that. I wasn't familiar with the term when I was drafting Emily Wilde. It was something that I saw readers labeling it as, and I was kind of like, cool, what's that? But I mean, I was familiar with obviously the kind of grim dark / hope punk, I think is the opposite, the kind of two poles of the fantasy genre. And so I knew that my series that I was working on fit towards the hope punk end. But cozy fantasy was new to me. So
Yeah, I often joke that I was dragged into it kicking and screaming because I did not understand how the book, where like in chapter 2, Fallon is just breaking somebody's arm for the smallest infraction. Then the horse kills someone. Then I burn down a city. And then I get on TikTok one day like, Kimberly Lemming is in cozy fantasy. And I'm like, are we sure? What does that term mean? No, it was great.
Funny. Yeah, well, my book starts with a kidnapping. So when like my friend told me that, I was like, are you sure? But I trusted her. She works at a publishing house and I don't. So I kind of went with what she said. But yeah, no, I think that's one of the really cool things about the cozy fantasy genre is a lot of people kind of find themselves here, which I think is very interesting. And so I think that kind of leads me to something I kind of want to talk about, which is like, what do we think makes a cozy fantasy romance? Because obviously all of us kind of, maybe many of us stumbled upon this, but now kind of looking back, maybe in hindsight, how do we kind of define this cozy fantasy romance? And so many elements of the romance genre and the fantasy genre don't necessarily align with cozy. So I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. I have many thoughts, but
Real quick, are we
first?
Checking the chat? Because it looks like some people are just sitting in the YouTube thing waiting for it to start.
Oh, interesting. I thought we were live on YouTube.
We are, but it looks like they're waiting for a ping and it still says starting soon.
I think it might be one of the older scheduled ones or something.
It refreshed. It also refreshed.
Oh, it refreshed. Okay.
So there are 89 people watching it, but it just blipped out and will have blipped back in again.
Okay. Thank you for bringing that up.
So I think this question must come up at every panel, actually. So I have a refined answer now because we keep talking about it. And the answer that I have said along with several other authors is that cozy is basically just a genre where you have an extra layer of removal from anything stressful. And that extra layer of removal can be any number of things. Like it can actually change depending on the author and the book. So it could be absurdity. It could be humor. It could be a kind of fairy tale feel to it. But basically, it's just there's something there that lets the reader disconnect a little bit from anything stressful, and it makes it easier for them to handle difficult things. And I always say, I always tell people, there's an author I hang out with, Tansy Rainer Roberts, who is an Australian cozy author, and she informed me of this, and I think it's hilarious. She said, "You can get away with just about anything in Australian cozy. You can have blood all over the walls as long as you have a stiff cup of tea involved." She said that's the layer of removal for Australian cozy. She was like, as long as there's tea, everything else goes.
That's a very I love that answer. The idea of there just being tea. I think humor is another big one. I think humor is one that I use a lot, that I kind of lean on because, like I said, my book starts with a kidnapping, so there's a lot of humor around said kidnapping. It makes it a little easier to deal with. But yeah, what are other people's thoughts? I would love to hear just kind of everyone's thoughts on this, and do you agree with Olivia? Do you disagree?
I agree. I would add that a lot of it also depends on what the character actually wants. Because one of my favorite cozy fantasies and a pretty newer book is Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wessel. And in that book, the main heroine literally eats people. Like she is a slime monster and is basically just like pulling a bunch of body parts together to look like a human so she can flirt with her girlfriend. And even though she's doing all these crazy, monstrous things, and again, she eats people, all she wants to do is cuddle up with her girlfriend. And it's such a sweet story. And I'm like, wow, this is so violent. But like, I have such warm fuzzies inside right now. So like, it gets a pass.
Yeah, I really
Absolutely.
like that. I think for me, like, and maybe it's easiest to answer the question as a reader, just because there are so many disparate ways of defining cozy. For me, what I look for is really two things. One is that kind of coziness in terms of the atmosphere, the ambiance. There's something there that feels like the book is just like a warm hug. Maybe it's set in a tea shop, maybe it's set, I don't know, wherever. And then for me, I also like to have a relatively optimistic ending, which isn't necessarily to say that the ending has to be happy. Things cannot work out in some respects for the characters, but overall, I like for the story to end on a note of hopefulness or optimism. Those two things are really all I need in order to see a book as cozy.
Yeah. I know as a reader I'm very anxious as a reader as I've gotten older, and I think more stressed out in general. And I know that, reading a fantasy romance in general can really stress me out because there's so many terrible things that can happen to these two lovers. Because you have if you read a rom-com, I'm never stressed out because, the hardest problem they have to deal with is Brad has to move back to his hometown to deal with the family's raccoon farm or something. And then like a fantasy novel, the big problem is, well, the man I love has turned into a giant snake and he's terrorizing the kingdom. And I have to either figure out whether I can just keep him in the throne room or decapitate him. So, like, the horror that can happen to these two people is just so escalated that I'm like this on the edge of my seat. And I love the cozy fantasy, as Olivia was saying, that you can de-escalate that situation by, with humor or absurdity and so forth. But my favorite cozy fantasies are the ones that bring the story down so much that a lot of the time the conflict is usually fairly small, but it's external to the person, to the couple, sorry, because a lot of the time in in fantasy romance, a lot of conflict is coming from between the couple. It's enemies to lover and they're literally stabbing each other. Whereas in a cozy fantasy, what I love, my ideal cozy fantasy, is when you have the two people working together to kind of solve the things that are happening around them, and it's bringing an emotional intimacy there, and they become a soft place to land. So all the things that I like in cozy fantasy, feeling comfortable, feeling joyous, the sense of that things are going to work out okay, is sort of exemplified by the couple themselves. They have all those cozy qualities within that sort of interaction that they're having. They're building trust, they're building emotional intimacy, and it just becomes this lovely part of the story as a whole. So yeah, I want to feel that the couple aren't going to betray each other. I want to feel that there's a happy ending in store for them. Even if there's somebody who's consuming a whole bunch of other people, I want them to have a soft place to land in that other person in general, you know? So in the end, the whole thing feels cozy, not just the external story. You know, even if it's a lovely tea house that they've created, if they're still stabbing each other, it's not a cozy fantasy to me. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that I've run into in that I've written a duology is that is one cohesive story. So I think, you know, having kind of that soft place to land at the end of book one isn't necessarily going to look the same as it would look for maybe other cozy fantasies.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another thing that I always kind of keep in mind, especially when I'm looking at series. That's not just because I'm a series writer. I haven't written any standalones yet. I'm working on one, but that's a different conversation. So, you know, when you're kind of looking at those series and you're kind of looking for that, you know, happy for now or happily ever after, it's going to look very different in a cozy fantasy than it would necessarily in a romance.
Yeah,
and I definitely agree with that. And I think this kind of leads me to something that I've been thinking about a lot with cozy fantasy lately is like, how high can the stakes actually get? And I think that's something that you touched on a little bit, Lisa, that I think is very interesting because I have fairly high stakes in my book, but a lot of people, like, you know, when I first started marketing it as a cozy fantasy, once I realized that was maybe the niche that it fell into, a lot of people were like, I was worried that people were going to come back and say this isn't cozy fantasy because of just some of the things that were going on in some of the high stakes scenarios or higher stakes scenarios. But I was surprised when a lot of people came back and they said, yes, no, this is cozy fantasy, and I really love the very cozy feeling that this gives me. So I think it would be awesome to hear from everyone, you know, like, where do you guys try to like lay the stakes? What do you guys feel like what are the heightened stakes for a cozy fantasy, since that's so different than maybe a regular fantasy series or standalone? Sorry.
Well, I think that really because cozy fantasy is such an ambiguous genre as far as I think it really just needs to feel cozy as we've been talking about, and it needs to have the kind of extra layer of removal. The stakes are just one element that can contribute to that. So I think it makes sense that most cozy fantasies end up being small personal stakes because that lends itself very well to a cozy feeling. But if you have other things in the book that blunt things, I'm sure you could raise the stakes quite high, as long as you have something to kind of to remediate that, to kind of counterbalance it and still make it cozy. I think it's really just a matter of what techniques are you using to make it cozy.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Anyone want to weigh in before I keep going?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I actually really like that term of like a layer of removal. I think for me, stakes to me aren't part of the cozy versus non-cozy. I think that you can absolutely have high stakes in a cozy fantasy. I think for me, what kind of helps with that is if the stakes are really high, if there's some kind of sense of like playfulness or whimsy kind of mixed in, which might sound odd if you're trying to save the world, but you can do it. And I mean, I've read authors that have succeeded at that. So I think that playfulness maybe can kind of play into what Olivia was talking about in terms of layers of removal.
I think all of our books have high stakes at some point in them, having read them, or at least mid to high. You know, even in mine, the female main character is in danger multiple times throughout it. But it's, again, how you deal with it. Is it whimsical? Is it humorous? I think also doing it, having a third person kind of perspective to it. I have a narrator, and I think that does de-escalate the situation and can often add humor or something to it that is unexpected in the situation. So, you know, for all of us, stakes are on the higher end, and we're all cozy fantasy. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, that's definitely, I think it's one of the interesting things, like as the community starts talking more and more about this, you know, as people are kind of defining this very ambiguous genre, as we've kind of spoken about. And so I think that also kind of leads to, you know, we're all like kind of a little bit across the board in where our books can fall as far as like, you know, other categories that our books can fit into. Like obviously we've got dragons and we've got paranormal and we've got all sorts of stuff going on. So I think something that I think is really interesting about the cozy fantasy genre is the way that tropes tend to fit into it. So like I have an enemies to lovers trope in mine, which isn't really something that people would necessarily quickly associate with cozy fantasy, but it's kind of built into the situation, being that a dragon kidnaps a knight at the beginning of the series for me. And so I think what might be really interesting to hear about from all of you is just, you know, how do you fit those other tropes into the genre and still kind of keep that cozy feeling? Or how did you feel like those tropes kind of melded into your book that wound up being kind of called cozy, I think would be a good way to put it.
Well, that's a very good question because as I said, when I started writing my first book in this vein, there wasn't really a cozy fantasy term. And I actually intentionally set out to subvert a whole bunch of tropes with it. It's not it's not something I use as a marketing term because most people don't care, but Half a Soul is a satire. So it was meant to critique a lot of the Regency genre tropes, you know, and I'd say even more so the second one, 10,000 Stitches, is basically questioning whether Prince Charming would actually be that great because he's rich and privileged and probably awful. And so, like, I don't know about fitting tropes in. Like, I really went out of my way to subvert a whole bunch of tropes, but it still ended up cozy. So I think tropes are less crucial for cozy than just the vibe, probably.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't really try to put in tropes. I mostly put on vibes. Now, that is untrue for the Alien book because I did, in fact, give them a book of tropes because the aliens are trying to get a bunch of humans to mate. So if you want, you can also just give them a book of tropes and make them follow it for reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think tropes are also something too that I feel like very often I hear that authors didn't go in intending to write a trope. It's just something that after they wrote it, they kind of like realized, oh, I can market the book this way. At least for me being an indie author, I have to do all my own marketing. So I'm constantly thinking about like, how can I tell people that they might like this book? So yeah, I think I definitely agree. And I think it's interesting to kind of hear, especially the satire perspective. I think that's a really interesting thing. I think satire and cozy, I feel like work very well together in a lot of ways. So yeah, cool. Awesome. So yeah, so I think maybe let's we've talked a lot about like cozy and tropes and things like that in fantasy. How do we all feel about trying to fit like the romance elements into the story? So I think that's something that as cozy fantasy romance authors, we kind of find ourselves in this place of having kind of three different genres that we're kind of almost working within. And so I think, you know, how do you kind of not only like how do you emphasize cozy in like a romance setting? You know, we've mentioned the soft place to land, which I think is a really awesome way of putting it. But you know, how do you take those elements that you will typically think of in romance scenarios and romance books and kind of fit them within this like lovely little cozy fantasy or this lovely little cozy environment?
Someone else gets to go. I'm sorry.
You're doing the thing. You're answering first for a lot of these, and I appreciate it.
Yes, it's very helpful.
Gosh, how do you fit in romance? I should know this. Minor romances. Toss in a kiss. In between fights. I don't know.
Yeah, it's tricky because I also wasn't aware of the term romantasy when I started writing my series. That was another thing that I just kind of saw people assigning to my books. So it wasn't really something that I did with a lot of thoughtfulness, honestly. Yeah, it's not a very helpful answer at all. I don't know. But I don't know. For me, like when it came to making a romance that felt cozy, it was really important for me to work from kind of a basis of friendship. I think there's just something, I mean, in my book, it's more like a frenemy type of relationship, but there is a friendship there. There's kind of a core of respect between the two protagonists. And I think that really helped. If you can, I like the term soft place to land. I sort of view creating a love interest in a cozy as being almost like creating a place of refuge for the protagonist.
Yeah.
where she can just feel like she or he or whoever it is can feel just really at home with that other person and in their company, which again can contribute to the coziness. I also really like to create a love interest who, to use the technical term, is not a jerk. It just has kind of some sort of core of goodness, because we quite often see the opposite in fantasy, and or at least that kind of darker love interest. And so for me, that's just something that I personally like to do as a writer to add to the coziness of it.
One of the things I love about Bumblebee is he's a lovable jerk. He's like he is good, but he just has that like I don't know. It's just that veneer of, oh, I don't care. No, I actually do. I care a lot.
I like that lovable jerk. I'm gonna use that from now on. Thank you.
I found that I read a lot of romance, so across the genres, like whether it's Regency or rom-com, like that used to be a great place for me to escape day-to-day life, especially when I was growing up in fantasy novels where, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, and the fantasy novels back then didn't have great female protagonists, really didn't have great romance elements, it was very sword and sorcery-ish. So, so after reading all those, I kind of got a feel for the romance tropes that I personally found really anxiety provoking, like miscommunication and the betrayal aspect and stuff. And so when writing a cozy fantasy, I tried to avoid those entirely and tried to create, I think like Heather was saying, this a relationship that's based primarily on friendship, so these people become good friends and they become emotionally intimate, and basically I wanted them to be the calm sort of center around all the chaos that's around them, because they're going to be ruling this kingdom of disreputable people, wild animals, crazy magic, and so I wanted them to be able to sit down at the end of the day and go, wow, that sucked, didn't it? And they're like, yep. And then, have this kind of camaraderie and joy together, even though they're in the midst of this terrible situation. So the cozy aspects I tried to build in, even though, I think Jess was talking about when it's a series, you are developing the relationship in this kind of really drawn out kind of way. So you've got your meet cute here and a little bit of the conflict that's bringing them together, and then you're developing it further on. But I tried to have them have their interactions in a really cozy setting. So there were a lot of fireside chats or, a lot of dialogue where they were kind of revealing themselves to each other, even as they were kind of bantering and so forth. So even though they're in the top of a mountain and it's freezing cold when they're having a discussion, there's still kind of these cozy aspects that are happening. He gives her his coat and so forth.
Oh, I like the idea. I think a lot of the romance comes from my novels by just putting it in sort of the fated mate situation, because it's one of my favorite tropes. However, one of the reasons I like it is not because it's insta-love, it's because we've already got the initial, okay, these two are going to end up together out of the way. The characters know this, but what I like to explore is why. Why of all the people did the cosmos put them together? And even if it's between a normal cinnamon farmer and a dragon, maybe you think there's nothing that could go on with them on the surface, but maybe they have the exact same sense of humor. Maybe he gets a kick out of scaring her and she's just like, oh, this jerk over here. And there's just like a lot of fun banter, usually by a fireside or with great food around. And to me, that just makes the story so much more fun.
Yeah.
Because yes, you have all these high stakes, but at the end of the day, maybe that werewolf literally is a golden retriever who's going to wag his tail anytime you do something cute. And it's just a lot of fun for me.
I think Fated Mates is very cozy in a way, because it gets rid of all the anxiety about not only that they're going to end up together, but they're going to treat each other well. And I think that for me is something that kind of gives me anxiety when I'm reading a fantasy romance with the typical alpha hole male, how he's not exactly kind often to our female main character. And so when you have the fated mate, part of that is this trope that they care for them, they look after them, that they care about them more than anyone else. And that is really a great anxiety relief, knowing that this character is going to treat this other character beautifully. And again, soft place to land, that no matter what's happening in the outside, if the world is burning down, they have each other's backs. And that's just a really relaxing dynamic. Right?
Yeah, well, so for romance as a genre, just romance, I feel that you can call just about anything a romance as long as there is a central romantic relationship, and the majority of the book is about the development of that relationship. Everything else in a romance, well, it has to end happily ever after, obviously, but everything else is kind of extraneous. You can change just about anything else, and it's still a romance. And so, when I say that, there is a romance in one of my books, that's how I perceive it. It's the fact that there is a central driving relationship that matters to the plot, and the book is largely about the development of that relationship. And this doesn't always, for The Witch would not, bless whoever decided it was cozy. I don't feel like it's cozy, but apparently everyone still thinks it's cozy. It's very gothic, but it has a very intense enemies to lovers, and most of the scenes have to do with the interaction between those two characters. And even when they're not in the same scene with each other, the scenes, at least in a sideways manner, tend to influence the relationship between those characters. And that's how I see a romance in a romantic fantasy. And I think what's most interesting to me about that is I don't necessarily believe that a romance has to be endless physical attraction. I'm demisexual, so that wouldn't work for me. Sometimes your interactions between the characters are still about their relationship, but it's not necessarily about their attraction. It's about how they fit together. It's about them working through issues between each other. It's about them discovering things they admire about each other. And not all of those things are instantly romantic, but they are all to do with the relationship. And that's what I find really compelling about romance. I want to believe that these characters know each other, admire each other, respect each other, and when they end up together, I need to believe that they're going to stay together, which is why I hate miscommunication tropes, because they're rarely resolved in a way that makes me think it's not going to happen again. Yeah. You need a really good reason for them to not be telling each other things other than just, well, I'm just scared to tell them. Because if you're just scared to tell them, that's going to happen again. Like, this person is clearly an avoidant personality, and this is going to happen over and over and over, and they've learned nothing. So I need to believe that by the end of the book, whatever the difficulties were, the characters have solved those difficulties in such a way that I believe they'll be able to continue solving difficulties over and over.
Yeah. Whenever there's a miscommunication trope, there should be an epilogue where both of those characters in front of a therapist and they're learning.
Exactly.
And you're like, okay, now they're okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine if there's like a really compelling reason that's not going to repeat itself, where it's like, no, I literally had a curse on me that meant I couldn't tell you, or something like that. Like, I understand that and I can get behind that. But if it's just, I was just scared to tell you, I'm like, that's not going to go anywhere good.
Yeah, I think that's something that, and something that you said that I think I really resonate with is this idea of the characters, maybe not even necessarily in a romantic way, but finding things that they really admire about each other. I think that's something that I try to build into all of the relationships that I work with within my writing. Because I think very often I'm kind of writing characters who are teaching each other things. I don't know if that's a trope or something, but I do think I find it very romantic and I find it very interesting often. And so when you find these situations where these characters are kind of really looking at this other person as like an expert in what they're doing, I find that very, very compelling in a lot of ways. And I think, that idea of admiration, maybe outside of romance, is something that can be incredibly romantic. Kind of that deepening of a friendship. I think someone said something like that in chat, which I think is another thing that is like a really awesome way to kind of handle romance, especially in a cozy environment. And especially I think I love a cold environment for a cozy romance personally. Everyone's cold and now they've got to share a blanket or a bed or whatever it is. I'm a big fan of that. So something I saw in chat that I think maybe we should talk about right now, because I think it is kind of fun, is are there any tropes that you guys tend to kind of avoid in your cozy fantasy romance, or maybe even your romance in general, but any tropes that maybe are kind of like things that you're not a big fan of? I think a lot of us have mentioned the miscommunication trope. That's one of my personal, which is funny because Howl's Moving Castle is one of my favorite books, but it is a major miscommunication trope. But at the same time, it's not something I like to work with in my writing. So anyone have any particularly, and to be clear, this is not to bash anyone who likes these tropes, but any tropes that we don't particularly like to work with or are not big fans of as readers, either or?
Well, I just went off on the miscommunication trope, but I will add very shortly. I cannot. The richer and more powerful and more nobly ranked a character is, the worse they are. That's just a hard rule in my series because that's how it is in real life. These people are awful. I cannot fantasize about kings and queens and princesses unless there is a serious humility arc involved, because God, they've messed up our world. And so I really cannot write kind of like handsome dukes or noble princes or whatever. And I have a grudge against the Brothers Grimm for being so monarchist in all of their fairy tales, because my God, have they left a legacy of us being like, once upon a time there was a beautiful, virtuous princess, and I'm like, she was not, I guarantee you. She was probably awful, and you wouldn't want to talk to her for 5 minutes. Anyway, that's me. Someone else.
Secret Baby. I can't stand it. I'll never do it. I've actively gotten the most outlandish birth control in my worlds because I do not want to deal with it ever. So actually, everyone does have a birth control rune, and it never fails. Never.
Thank you. Thank you.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you.
I always say I'm not a huge fan of love triangles, which I'm a huge hypocrite because I wrote a YA duology that had a love triangle. But generally, I don't know. As a reader, I'm just not drawn to them. I always end up rooting for, one or the other and just getting annoyed with the other one for being around. So yeah, I'm not a love triangle person.
And it's never the guy that you wanted to end up with that she ends up with.
No.
Most of the time, I want the guys to realize, hey, she's not worth it. Let's hang out, and then they run off together, and that never happens either.
I need a book like that.
I like the opposite, where this is where the dark romance love in me comes out. I need them to be so unhinged about it that one might end up murdered by the end of it. That's a love triangle I want to read. Let it be just ridiculous.
Okay, I will say in the opposite though, I do love what you just said about I do want my love interests unhinged. Okay,
yes, yes.
I want them so devoted to each other that they are murdering people that
actively and with gusto.
I love that. Awesome. So I think this kind of also goes along with I might be repeating a question. If I am, please feel free to tell me. But are there anything when you're writing your stories, any tropes or things that you like to work with that you find particularly difficult to keep cozy? So I think a really good example of this is the third act breakup, which I personally am not a fan of. I will admit that's my least favorite trope, I think, is the third act breakup situation. So if there's anything like that you guys kind of tend to work with or tend to use, are there any things that you find difficult to kind of make cozy or are still kind of play with in a more cozy realm? But it sounds like we're all kind of willing to throw anything in there, but I'd still like to hear.
Probably the fact that my favorite type of hero is the unhinged, immortal weirdo that's going to go way too far to prove his love. So again, I am burning down towns and everything, but they're doing it for love, so I guess that makes it fine.
I'm sure those fires are very cozy.
You can roast s'mores, ignore the screams of the fallen, it's fine.
Look, I'm just saying, like, after someone you can build a nest in, I don't think anyone has any excuse to say something can't be cozy at this point.
Exactly. I love that book so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me too, I think, yeah, I very much, I love an unhinged love interest. Personally, my love interest in my duology is a dragon who is very quick to kill, for the main character. So I think, yeah, same exact thing. Cool. So that I kind of, we're kind of sticking with this trope conversation. I didn't realize how trope heavy the last half of these questions I prepared were. But what are your favorite tropes to play with, which we've maybe answered this a little bit, but maybe if there's any that you haven't mentioned or haven't had the chance, that hasn't felt like an appropriate time, I would love to hear like what you guys love to put in there, such as an unhinged love interest.
I love forced proximity. It used to be such a
one.
thing in like
Oh.
early 2000s and 90s anime where like there'd be an avalanche or something and you just had to be in the same room for an
Yeah.
undisclosed amount of time. And it's so cold, you may as well cuddle because you might die if you don't. So
I feel like everyone here can get behind there's only one blanket. Like, it's
there's
just
only one blanket.
Only one bed, only one blanket.
See, but I'm probably the one that's going to screw it up because I love forced proximity and I love the only one bed trope. But my whole book is about getting those little tropes and kind of twisting them so that they're not going to work how you think it is, and it's not.
So
gonna
there's
work.
too many beds.
There's so many blankets. No. Well, like this in the next book, there's only one bed because the kingdom that's sentient is forcing them into this room together. But when you use it in a romantic, usually in romances it's for a single night, and you get that sexual tension kind of ratcheting and kind of often explored, so forth. But in Otherworld, there's only one bed forever. So instead of it being like really really sexy, it's kind of like this way trying to make it more cozy. It's kind of a way where they hang out and they have these kind of nighttime conversations with each other, and it's sort of a way towards more emotional intimacy than sexual intimacy, even though they do wake up like that every now and then. But in the most part, it's just trying to make it cozier as opposed to doing what you expect with it. But yeah, forced proximity all the way. There needs to be more of it. Everyone needs to be almost stapled together
Mhm.
for it to get really.
Now I kind of want to see one where they're trapped in like a furniture store. Just like, why are you still in my bed? There's 1,000 other beds.
Get out of here.
So this isn't a romantic trope, but it is one of my favorite tropes, and that is orange and blue morality.
Yeah.
Which is just the idea of any of the characters in your book having a clear, like, they have a morality. It's very clear they have some kind of framework in their head that makes sense to them, but it doesn't match to anything normal or human, and it's just impossible for a human being to figure out. And that's part of just why I love fairies so much, is because they're so commonly full of orange and blue morality, where it's just like, this is a thing that makes sense to them, and they just killed a bunch of people, but they think that was the right thing to do. And if I play my cards right, I'm not sure what's going on in there, but maybe I can point them at someone else. Like, it's just so weird, and I enjoy it.
I love that term, orange and blue. I think you're the first person I heard that term from, so I really enjoy it, and it's so accurate for fairies. I think for me, one of my favorite tropes is the found family dynamic, which you see a lot. Yeah, you see a lot in cozy. It's almost like in almost every cozy I've seen. Yeah, and I think that the great thing about that is that throwing a bunch of characters together with different personalities from different walks of life, etc., forcing them to kind of bounce off each other, have all kinds of conflicts and learn things. And it's just very revealing in terms of the character and the character development, which again can create that kind of emotional kind of closeness. And again, adding to the cozy vibe, and almost like the characters are just kind of finding home in each other. You don't even need the cottagecore aspect, which I was also going to say, I love the cottagecore trope as well. But found family can almost kind of be that kind of refuge in that cottage for the protagonist.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you bring up found family. Oh goodness, which is as a queer author and someone obviously a queer person, I think found family is something that I so often gravitate towards, because very often especially for queer people my age, you grow up kind of without your biological family around. So you find yourself in these situations where the people that you feel most the most familiar connection to are people that you have found and chosen on your own. And so that idea of chosen family, I think, is really, really strong and can be incredibly powerful in a romance book, and a fantasy book, either or. So I think that's really interesting. That's also one of my favorite tropes, just to throw that out there. Yeah, so I think the next question I have for everyone, and this is going to be fun because we've already mentioned our love for unhinged romantic leads. So what is, I would love to hear, like, what are your favorite things to do when building a romantic lead? So for me, I always love to make them just very unhinged, very kind of in that same orange and blue morality that Olivia mentioned, that idea of like, it makes sense to them, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to anybody else. So, where do you guys tend to like pick up like their complexities and their motivations, and how do you build a romantic lead that you think works really well in cozy fantasy, but is also just like very fun and interesting and still complex without maybe necessarily falling into those like, oh, he's a jerk, like happens very often in fantasy. I think we've all kind of mentioned that a little bit here or there. So I would love to hear more about that.
I like them to just have like a bunch of weird quirks. So like maybe they're really obsessed with breakfast. Maybe they are just have to have a good cup of coffee. Otherwise they just can't deal with anything.
These are normal things. I feel
maybe I should say rather taking normal quirks and kind of pushing them to an extreme you don't normally see in ordinary humans. But yeah, and I love that kind of just building a character based off of those kind of strange kind of eccentricities. Because when you think about it, I mean, that's all of us to some degree. So it just is a lot of fun. And also it's a really great way to just kind of create a character that doesn't feel like he's just kind of the, I don't know, the archetype that we've all seen a million times in fantasy.
No, I'd agree with that. I definitely love giving them odd little quirks. Like Dante, even though he's this big, powerful dragon, he cannot stand uncleanliness. So he will sit there and buy a whole house rather than stay in an inn because they just wash their sheets in between and don't clean thoroughly enough. It's not good enough. He'll buy a new house.
I love that.
I had a thought and then I lost it. What are we talking about? Oh yes, building
romantic leads. Yeah.
I start talking and my brain's like, wait, what? No. So actually, there's only one thing that I cannot deal with in a male main character, and that is cruelty without a point. I can even have a male main character who is cruel as long as there's a purpose behind it and it's a tool. But if it's just because they fall into it naturally, or if it's because they enjoy hurting other people, I cannot deal with it. I think almost anything else is on the table. I just need to know that this is a character who will not, without purpose, hurt other people just for fun. And unfortunately, I think the thing about kind of the alpha hole trope that probably most of us in here can't deal with is that a lot of times it falls into that trap of they're just hurting other people because it's natural to their behavior or because they enjoy it. And that, I don't think there's any coming back from that. Like, there's no redeeming quality to that. I think everything else is something that you can remediate or deal with, but people who enjoy hurting other people do not generally get better about that.
Yeah, and I think, something for me with my book, my romantic lead, they're a non-binary dragon who raised themselves. So a lot of times they do things and they don't understand fully that the things that they're doing are incorrect or maybe not what they should be doing. Like, for example, they kidnap the knight because they think he's pretty and they would like, to get to know him better. But obviously that is not the way to go about that situation. And so I think kind of going along with that idea of like not going for cruelty with like out reason or providing that layer of accidental or not understanding, I think that's where I tend to fall in with my romantic leads. I really like to see them trying to understand the world. And a few of my friends have called me out for this, in that I tend to write romantic leads who like raised themselves or didn't have parental figures, or, you know, don't necessarily understand what the normal social norms are, which I think are maybe has says something about me, but we're not going to get into that right now. And, you know, I think with romantic leads in particular, it can be so interesting to kind of see, you know, what their motivations are and try and reveal those motivations to the reader to really kind of get into their head, which can be difficult when you're not doing like multi-POV or something like that. And so I think, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
What I really like about
Yeah.
A lot of cozy characters is that you often, well, in cozy books that I really enjoy, is that it's often an archetype or a stereotype character, say for instance the warrior, and a cozy fantasy shows you a different aspect of their personality. So if it's like Legends and Lattes, you have this this warrior who gives it up and opens a coffee shop, and you see this more human, softer aspect of their personality. And I know when I was writing my main male character, and I wrote, Between was written quite a while ago, he looks like an alpha hole from the surface. You know, he's a king, he's a powerful sorcerer, he wears a lot of black leather, he rules a really villainous kingdom. And so when you first meet him in the first half of the book, it's the female main character, Sasha's POV. And so in the time she does meet him, he's a little cold, he's a little sarcastic, he's very upfront about this fact that his kingdom sucks. And so you have this view of him as, oh, what's he going to be really like? But in the second half of the book, it's all from his perspective. And you realize that ruling this kingdom, because it slices life, so you're following him on a day just trying to run this place, and you realize how much admin is involved in ruling a really terrible kingdom, and how exhausting it is to be, fixing sinkholes and, stopping his disreputable peasant population from running around and doing bad things. And so, what ends up humanizing him is this fact that he's just like us in some ways. He's exhausted, his to-do list is far too big, he really needs a sandwich and a hug. And so he becomes cozier in that respect when you actually see what his life is like. And I think even my female main character, she's a school teacher, which is a very cozy kind of profession, cute little 5-year-olds, and she's trying to find her place in the world. She's 30 and she thinks she should have it together, and she hasn't quite yet. So I think these characters become cozy when you kind of see the more human aspect of who they are. So even if they are a terrifying dragon, or if they are the typical alpha hole, as soon as the cozy element comes in is where you see what they're lacking in life, what they need, how the female or male character or the other MC can help them find what they're seeking and help kind of soothe them in many ways. And I think that's how it can, you get these you can build your character to be more cozy, even when they at first seem really quite terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got about 15-ish minutes left here. So I do want to make sure we get some chat questions in here. I did see one earlier that I really liked, so I'm going to start with that one. But it's what's the easiest way to find a variety of cozy fantasy? And then they continue on to say, I only seem to find the same few books I've already read at bookstores. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to answer this one first. Personally, my biggest advice is start checking out indie fantasy. I think that's something that is kind of an unexplored aspect of, it's so big now. Indie authors and indie publishing is so much easier than it used to be. And I've obviously mentioned being an indie author. But, getting on Instagram and TikTok and trying to follow indie authors and kind of pay attention to what they're doing, because oftentimes within the indie community, we're all kind of advertising each other's books and kind of trying to lift each other up. So I think if you're interested in finding more cozy fantasy and a larger variety of cozy fantasy, I definitely say check out the indie space. And yeah, so do you guys have any other things you want to add to how to find a variety of cozy fantasy?
Well, I review stuff on my Goodreads. So most of the books I've read that I thought were really great, I will take the time to write a review for. So there's a whole list there. There are some indie books in there. Obviously, I have indie books out still. I would also say, this is going to sound shameless, I have a Patreon, but it's a Patreon that's with a whole bunch of other cozy authors. And so basically, we all have the same Discord that we send our people to. And many times people will join and then they'll be like, oh my God, my TBR just got like 8 times as long because, by definition, we're all very similar authors and we all write like, kind of cozy gas lamp type stuff. And so it's instant bam, like, oh, look, there's a bunch of authors to read. So yeah, either one of those. Like a lot of the same authors on my Discord, I obviously enjoy and have read and reviewed. So Goodreads is one of the ways to pick up on some of that.
I'd also say if you like audiobooks, if you're an audiobook fan, checking out Podium Audio. They tend to pick up a lot of indie authors and produce their books, and they've got really high quality production in their audiobooks, and they have a lot of cozy fantasies. So the House Witch series, for instance, is one of them that's on there. So definitely check them out as well if you're interested in sort of the indie audiobook scene.
This may be kind of an obvious one, but I really like just talking to the people that run my local independent bookstore. They always have really good recommendations. Yeah, you can just go and browse the shelves, which as an introvert, I sometimes am like, well, I'm just going to do that. But if you can bring yourself to just tell, the person that's working there on staff that you really enjoyed whatever it was, House in the Cerulean Sea, Legends and Lattes, etc. And they will be able to come up with recommendations that are similar to those or that are quite different. If you tell them that you're tired of reading that type of book, they'll quite often be able to steer you towards other titles.
Oh yeah, like that's great because booksellers always have at least one book they're totally feral about. So they will tell you like, oh, okay, you have to read this book. It's great.
No, I'd agree. Honestly, I found the easiest way for me is just type in cozy fantasy or like indie cozy fantasy in the TikTok search bar. It's so easy to curate your feed, and I'm finding new books all the time on the app just because of that.
Yeah, TikTok I think is like a very a sleeper place to find really cool stuff. So looking at chat again, so I do kind of have like a longer one, but this one is from someone who is writing their master's thesis on romantasy. And so they'd really love to know how reader feedback and fan interactions influence your writing process and to what extent you're writing what you want to be writing with an eye for what readers expect, which I think is very interesting, but it is long. So if you need me to repeat anything, please let me know.
So I've had a constant push and pull with my readers, and it's made my writing career so fun. For example, when I was writing the second book, there was some pushback about how people didn't like that I was using modern slang in a fantasy novel. And so on Twitter, I said, hey, it's my world. I do what I want. If y'all don't stop with this nonsense, I'm going to rename book 2 That Time I Got Drunk and Yeeted a Love Potion at a Werewolf. And that actually went viral. And people said, do it. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to do it. And even more than that, they're just like, we want something spicier. And it was at the time where spice was like really kicking off and they wanted all the scenes, all the whatever. And I don't like filling the entire book full of that. So I'm just like, okay, you want spice? I'll add tentacles to a werewolf. All right, shut up. And so
I love this. I'm so about it.
in reality, it's just like, okay, you want me to do one thing? I'm going to make it worse. And now I have an alien romance coming up with dinosaurs and Tamagotchis. Mostly because I'm like, all right, I'll get so much worse.
Yeah.
So really, the more you poke at me, the further I'm going to go.
I think in that vein, I think the best authors write something that they believe in, that they care about, that they want to write. You can and should massage that just a little bit to meet genre expectations in the sense of like, you don't want to give your readers something they're totally not expecting, because it feels like almost like a betrayal. Like, obviously, you don't want to write a romance that doesn't have a happily ever after that's mean. Like, it's just not cool. But apart from that, I think you should really know as an author what your purpose is going into a book, and that's what makes the book good. That's what sets it apart from AI writing. Like, you need to have a point. You need to have a human element. And I think that authors who try to hew too closely to reader expectations lose their unique voice. which is why I think Kimberly's doing so well. Like I said, I'm not saying you should never meet genre expectations. I'm not saying you shouldn't consider reader feelings and stuff, but there's a difference between doing that and completely changing your books to suit certain readers. That's just it's not a great way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe our final question here. Do you think it's possible for a book to have both horror and cozy fantasy elements?
Yeah, again, someone you build a nest in, she eats people
Yeah.
actively.
I literally wrote The Witch Would Not, and apparently it's cozy. I still don't agree, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, cozy horror is a thing, right? So I mean, these are elements that can mix. I'm a bit of a wimp, so I don't know if cozy horror might not be cozy enough for me, but it is a thing that can coexist with fantasy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on being a wimp. I am a scaredy cat. I'm afraid of my own shadow. I am not going to be in the horror genre anytime soon. But I do think, one of my good friends, another indie author, whose name I'm forgetting. Oh my goodness, Madeline Burgett, who wrote Caraway of the Sea. She calls her book grim cozy, which I think is kind of in that same vein of having that kind of maybe some like super darker elements versus what maybe some people. But as this panel has kind of discussed, it seems like the idea of like cozy fantasy in general can really be a lot of things. So I think that's really cool to see, and I that's always the mindset I kind of went into with it. So I'm really excited to hear all of you guys kind of agreeing with that and making me feel a little validated right now. I'm an indie author. I'm very often on my own little island, so it's really cool to hear from you all. And I do think I want to give you all a chance to kind of not reintroduce yourselves, but mention or plug anything that you guys would like to plug before we sign off. I do want to mention, just for everyone who loves cozy fantasy, if you're interested in more indie cozy fantasy, the Cozy the Day Away sale, goodness, it's a stuff your Kindle Day style sale that's happening literally tomorrow. So there's going to be tons and tons of cozy fantasy, indie cozy fantasy on sale for sometimes free, sometimes 99 cents, sometimes at least 50% off. So that's one big thing that I really wanted to plug. And so if anyone else wants to, add anything here, remind everyone of books coming out, now would be the time.
Well,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you first.
Well, I got abducted by aliens and I'm trapped in a rom-com. Comes out February 18th.
Yay!
Woo!
Great. Echoes of the Imperium comes out October 29th. Yes. So it's coming up really soon. It's a steampunk fantasy with fairies and goblins and airships and possibly timely observations about empire and fascism. And I wrote it with my husband, Nicholas Atwater, who is way better at humor than I am. So it should be funnier. I know that sounds a little odd in a book about fascism, but still, it is. It's witty. I love it.
Take my money, Olivia. Just take my money.
Exciting.
To your part of the screen. Between by me is it's a Halloween themed fallish fantasy rom-com, and we are actually having a buddy read for it starting on the 21st, because that coincides with when the book actually takes place on the 21st to the 31st. There's giveaways and prizes, and you can find your way there on my website at the Sleazy Weasel Tavern, which is my book group, and it's a great deal of fun. Lots of wackiness in there, so join us.
Yeah, and for me, I think I mentioned Emily Wild's Compendium of Lost Tales comes out in February from Del Rey. I can't remember the exact date, but it's sometime in February. So that's the next one for me. I have a newsletter, so if you're on Substack, my newsletter is called From the Other Lens. You can subscribe there. I do monthly topics about writing and craft info.
Yeah, and I totally realized I forgot to say, Armor of Dusk comes out December 6th, so it's coming out very soon. So it's the second book, the sequel to Feathers of Dawn, my debut. And thank you everyone again for coming, and thank you Mystic for having us. This was an absolutely lovely panel, and you guys all were super insightful. So thank you so much, and thank you for letting me be host. I really enjoyed getting to talk with all of you and everything.
Thank you, Jess. You're
Thank you
wonderful.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you
thank
for
you.
having
Thank
us.
you for having
Yeah,
me.
this was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I don't know if we're still live. I have a feeling Mystic will come out and tell us if we are soon.
And thank you for everyone who watched and who's typing things in the chat room.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you to all of the questions.
thanks for
They were
coming,
really
everyone.
lovely. Yeah. And goodbye, YouTube, since when we first got in, I said hi, so goodbye. Yeah, I think you guys did awesome. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
really great. I hope all of the questions were.
I would
Yeah.
like it to be known that I thought the last one was going to be I want to hear the would you rathers because I saw that question in the chat.
Oh no!
And my overzealous ass pulled up a picture of those demons from Castlevania, and I had a whole speech planned.
You are speaking. My main character looks like Alucard. All of my friends make fun of me for this.
I mean,
Yeah.
Alucard is great, but that is not my would you rather. I'm
No.
talking about the demons that killed the priest.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean.
When he says lies and your house of God, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
this is romance. What's going on?
Big fan. Big fan of. There's. Oh goodness.
Not how I thought that was going to go. So.
I was like, oh, I have to get mine signed up because obviously we're going to do that question. And of course, no one else was thinking that.
I didn't see that question. Unfortunately, I would have asked it if I had. Because we'll also like I keep seeing people doing the hear me out cakes on TikTok.
Right.
It's funny that you mentioned this because a lot of the like night creatures in Castlevania probably would have been on my hear me out cake.
It would have just been all of them. Everyone in that
Many.
show.
I'm really sorry, you guys. I've actually got to go. But
Yeah, okay.
it was so great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so
Happy
much.
Thanksgiving early.
Happy
Yeah.
early Thanksgiving.
Yeah, but yeah, I still don't. I think we might still be live because I looked.
It says live stream chat. So maybe
Yeah, we're still getting comments.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Mystic is